Hello, class. As you guys know, in ethics, I don't use PowerPoints. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a quick recorded lecture. I already lectured on chapters 3 and 23 in class the first week. So I am going to lecture on chapters 5 and 19, and then I will also do a separate lecture for chapters 6 and 10. Your first quiz, which will be next Monday, and I will open that up on my IoT at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then I'm going to close it at 3. But your first quiz is over chapters 3 and 23. So just remember, in ethics, you only have 3 quizzes in this class throughout this term. So I'm going to start with chapter 5. And as you guys know, chapter 5 is over evidence-based practice. So evidence-based practice began to evolve around the mid-1990s, and the term best practice was used to describe the strategies or methods that work most efficiently or achieve the best results. This concept of best practice is often associated with the process of benchmarking, which involves identifying the most successful companies or institutions in a particular sector of an industry, examining their methods of doing business, using their approach as the goal or gold standard, and then replicating and refining their methods. And, the ultimate goal in nursing remains to provide optimal patient care with the goal of enhancing nursing practice, and which in turn enhances their nursing practice, which in turn improves patient or system outcomes. Also, on page 71, it states when and where is evidence-based practice used. It is used throughout. It's also the concept of evidence-based practice is also valued across nursing roles and responsibilities, and it prepares nurse clinicians to lead evidence-based practice initiatives. And so a lot of times staff nurses are expected to participate in evidence-based practice initiatives. There are a few countries, that have adopted this approach to care several years before it became popular in the United States. Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom used it years before it ever became popular here in the United States. So, it is out there in practice, but where does evidence-based practice begin? It begins at the bedside. It begins with questions that arise in our practice setting. It could be a question: what is the optimal nurse-to-patient ratio for a specific unit? Or who is the most qualified care provider for our sickest patient today? So, always remember the evidence-based practice begins with questions that arise in your practice setting. And, where do we find our answers to where do we find the evidence to answer our nursing questions? Of course, we do have our institutional standards, our policy and procedure manuals that are a common reference source for nurses in practice. But nursing co-workers or other healthcare providers, such as physicians, pharmacists, or therapists, we might consult them. Although these approaches are extremely common, these approaches are more likely to yield clinical answers that are tradition-based rather than evidence-based. So in medicine and pharmacy, or in medicine and pharmacology, the randomized controlled trial, or the RCT, has been considered the gold standard of clinical evidence, where most generally in nursing will use more the qualitative, descriptive, or quasi-experimental study. Those are more common methods of inquiry in nursing research rather than the RCTs. So, some of the additional sources that we can find information could be benchmarking data. It could be related to infection control data. It could be related to quality improvement data. But supporting evidence-based practice. The first strategy to garner is we have to have administrative support, because we have to remember the implementation of evidence-based practice should not be at an individual staff level pursuit. We have to have buy-in from everybody to make sure that everybody buys into the evidence-based practice that we are trying to implement. So it is very important to have administrative support to be able to implement in our evidence-based practice. So strategies for the new nurse to promote evidence-based practice. What are different strategies? We can subscribe to journals. We can use and encourage use of different multiple sources. We want to find established sources of evidence in our specialty. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. And we want to question and challenge nursing traditions and promote a spirit of risk-taking. And this is all on page 75 in box 5.3. And then also on page 76, benchmark with high-performing teams, units, or institutions. There is the University of Iowa, Ohio State University, and McMaster University of Ontario are three North American institutions that have established reputations as leaders in evidence-based nursing practice. And even though, nurses are the ones that usually take the lead in developing or revising these standards, just remember we have to have buy-in from other interdisciplinary healthcare team members because it is essential to achieve successful implementation and consistent changes in practice. So we do have to have that buy-in from the other interdisciplinary healthcare teams because it is essential to achieve successful implementation and make those changes in our practice. So that is like the short of evidence-based practice. You guys can read chapter 5 and just read through chapter 5, but those are the most important parts of it that I wanted to get across to you guys. And then chapter 19. Chapter 19 is about the technology in healthcare. As you guys know, technology in healthcare has changed over the years, but what we have to remember with technology can cut costs, it can improve patient outcomes, it can streamline our workflow, and it can improve information accessibility. But technology also comes with technology as a cost because of online training, and it continues to bring about the new ethical dilemmas, including the need to ensure human element is not lost in, our patient care. So, we have biometrics, we have point of care testing, we have computerized data access, computerized data entry, we have our electronic health records, we have telehealth, we've got computerized physician provider order entry and clinical decision support systems. Those are all part of, the technology advances that are shaping the healthcare in the 21st century. So this chapter 19 starts on page 270. 271 talks about biometrics. It talks about biomechatronics, which creates machines that replicate or mimic how the body works and will continue to increase in prominence in the future. It talks about surgical robots. What we have to remember is surgical robots are not cheap. For hospital organizations to adopt a robot, their volumes must be large enough to produce a viable financial return within 6 years. And they've done a study, and over that 13-year period of the study, Robotic surgeries cost on an average of $2,700 more per patient. Robots are increasingly being used in diagnostics because of their accuracy typically exceeds that of human caregivers. Robots as direct care providers. Think about using a robot as a direct care provider. And they have the menial service robots. That one of the best known one was Paro, which was a sophisticated interactive robot designed to help people relax and reduce their stress levels. It's the robot, which as of 2017 was the 8th generation of a design that has been in use since 2003, and it's shaped like a baby harp seal, and it can remember its name and change its behavior depending on how it's treated. However, many consumers and healthcare providers, their concern with using robots, though, is the lack of emotion with the robots. So, I'm not quite sure about all the different types of robots, of providing healthcare, but I could see where it is a lack of emotion in robots. So, they also have different robots that they've been putting out into practice in Japan. They have their physical service robots, and then they have the mental service robots. So, like I say, they are in use out there, but, I can just see the lack of emotion. But they do have some that robots that can develop a personality and blink and giggle as people interact with it. So, they're out there. And then, the other thing about the robots is the reduction in the amount of human contact because they lack sensitivity to people's feelings, and there's a loss of privacy also that's associated with using robots. And then biometrics. Biometrics is the science of identifying people through physical characteristics such as fingerprints, handprints, retinal scans, voice recognition, facial structure, and dynamic features. Of course, our fingerprints is still the most common type of biometrics in healthcare. Another one they're starting to utilize is the palm vein patterns. So, they use those sometimes with like a Pixis system. It used to be where you would just enter like your password. Now they're specified, you use your thumbprint and it will open. Then there's a smart card and smart objects. Smart cards are credit card sized devices with a chip that stores memory and an operating system that records a patient's entire clinical history. They have smart objects that are everyday objects that are injected with easy-to-use software that give the devices some degree of intelligence. They have smart hospital rooms. They can have like computer screens that pull up the patient records and display diagnoses and treatment plans as well as vital signs. It can also provide caregivers with real-time patient medical record and provide instant bedside access to the patient's electronic medical charts. There's also smart pumps for IVs. The smart pumps, they have safety software inside that prevents IV medication errors by setting a minimum and maximum dose limits as well as preset limits that cannot be overridden by a clinician's discretion. However, the end user of smart pumps, they develop workarounds, and IV medication errors still are common. This is because healthcare providers, they become desensitized to faults and repetitive alarms, and they lower alarm volumes or simply turn off the alarms to decrease their alarm fatigue, which in turn places patients' safety at risk. So just because they have the smart pumps doesn't mean that it is always beneficial to the client, because it depends on the workarounds that the healthcare providers that nurses do use at the bedside. We also have point-of-care testing. Point of care testing, that comes in very handy because you gather your test specimens near the patient or at the bedside. And then by networking via the internet, you can download the results to the central clinical lab, and it eliminates the manual documentation of test results. So point of care testing can be very beneficial because you can perform it right at the bedside and not have to wait for lab results to come back from the lab before you make any clinical decisions. And then we have barcoding administration. And barcoding, it is developed to help caregivers ensure the right medication and the right dose is given to the right patient at the right time by the right route. Barcoding works by requiring the medication giver to match with a handheld scanner their name tag, the barcode on the patient's identification band, and the medication to be given. However, doesn't come without any problems because nurses often develop workarounds that undermine the barcoding safeguards. So, use barcoding to your advantage. Try not to develop workarounds because that's where medication errors can occur. There is also computerized physician provider order entry. And that, and they developed that because there were so many medication errors, especially when trying to transcribe a physician's order, especially if they don't write very plainly. Because 90% of medication errors occurred during manual ordering and transcribing, which is a handwriting and interpreting of the prescription. And using the CPOE systems can help eliminate these types of errors. So, physicians, I remember when it first went into effect, physicians were like, oh, we're never going to learn how to do this. This is just a pain. And they would try to talk nurses into doing it for them, putting it into the system. And we finally had to implement where we would provide education to the physicians of how to do it, but we were allowed to sit next to them and show them how, but they had to enter it themselves. And, so the thing of it is, it does cost a lot to keep all this technology up to date and running. So, but it is very beneficial to our patients because it can reduce errors. But the one thing we have to remember is technology is never a substitute for clinical judgment or critical thinking. Technology is a tool, and it's an adjunct to nurses' clinical skills, but it's never a replacement. And then, of course, we have our electronic communications. Computers are a big part of our, work that we do in a healthcare organization now because, it's part of our interdisciplinary team communication and care documentation. So there's a lot of different, most organizations do use computers now to document everything. There are a few that are still out there that do still use manual documentation. However, most of them do use some sort of computer system. And especially, the electronic health record, now that it's on computers, it's available 24/7. But always remember that electronic health record is only as good as the person viewing the information that is in that chart. So you still have to look through the chart. You still have to know what's going on with your patients. Review that electronic health record. And a lot of patients, feel less satisfied because they think that providers pay more attention to the computer screen than they do face-to-face with them. So they sometimes feel that their visits are less personal. And, there's also telehealth. Telehealth is out there. It's a form of virtual care that allows healthcare providers to care for patients over a distance. Now, with all this COVID going on, a lot of clinics are using, telehealth to talk to their patients instead of having them come into the office. And so, that's just something that's really taken off right now with COVID. So, there's so many different things, but the thing that we have to remember is, patient satisfaction is increased sometimes in the involvement in healthcare decision making because it reduces the travel time and expense, and they can just be at home, talking to their physician instead of having to go in and having a visit at the clinic itself. And another portion that I wanted to point out is on page 277 in box 19-1, the Leapfrog Group CPO standards. In order to fully meet the Leapfrog CPO standards, hospitals their system must alert physicians to at least 50% of common serious prescribing errors, and that applies to adult hospital patients only. And that information is in box 19-1 on page 277. And remember, we have the internet. Our patients are, they become experts. They're better informed because of the internet. However, we have to make sure that the information that they find on the internet is the correct information, because sometimes they may not fully understand that information that is available to them. And even if that information is correct or accurate, they sometimes, patients will come in and they've already self-diagnosed themselves as to what is wrong with them. So we do have to, make sure that the information that they are, locating on the internet is accurate. So, the big thing about technology is it worth the cost? Well, some experts argue that technology is not only expensive, but it needs constant upgrades, and the education needed to be competent in the use of all this technology is never ending. So who is responsible which individual is responsible to make sure that you are competent in interacting with the technology that you are using? It is we have to make sure that we are competent in the technology that we use. So, it is because, technology is rapidly changing, and it is one of the cost drivers in the United States healthcare system. So it is very important that we, as nurses, understand the technology that is available and use it to our advantage. And that is chapter 19. Like I said, your first quiz is going to be over chapters 3 and 23. And quiz 2 will be over chapters 5, 6, 10, and 19. I gave you that quick lecture for chapters 5 and 19, and then I will put out one more video of chapters 6 and 10 for you guys, and that will get us up to week 4. Have a great weekend.